Yep. Hi, everyone. As I said, I'm Elizabeth Cruz, the Director of Democracy Beyond Elections, which is a program of the Participatory Budgeting Project. We have a coalition of local, national, state orgs that are looking to build a movement for participatory democracy around the country. So with that, I'll pass it over to Charles to tell you a little bit more.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I had a little bit of trouble with the mute button there. But as I mentioned before, my name is Charles, and I'm a program associate here at PBP, and I mainly focus on the Participatory Justice Initiative that we have, and also our Democracy Beyond Elections campaign, which we're going to talk a little about today. So let's jump right into it. So Democracy Beyond Elections is a program of the Participatory Budgeting Project that was initiated in 2019 with the aim of creating a collaborative campaign to win structural democracy reforms that deepen participatory democracy and civic engagement beyond and between elections. And while it initially started solely as a program of PBP alone, it has since expanded to include 29 partners in total, of which Ujima is a member, and then also another Boston Center organization that you all may be aware of, the Center for Economic Democracy is a member, and then our newest member is the National Organization Partnership for Working Families. So we're growing pretty consistently, and we've got an exciting group of folks that are undertaking this work with us. So we're going to talk a little bit about the framework that we use to think about participatory democracy and the difference between that and what we're used to as citizens now. And so I have a question for you all. I'm curious, and you can unmute yourselves and speak into the room since we're small enough, or you can just enter into the chat. But I'm curious to know, how does policymaking work in Boston, or at least how have you experienced it? How have you participated in crafting different policies at the city or the state or the regional level? Particularly, how has it felt?
Felt a little bit removed, as if at least my voice or those that I know are most familiar with the impacts and of those policy changes feel a little bit more distance.
Yeah. What about others? How has it felt to participate in crafting policy in Boston?
You know, sometimes I feel like I miss the opportunity to like support it. Like if I'm not available to do the thing at the time when people are doing the thing, sometimes I feel like, damn, I missed my opportunity to like support. And it always just feels like things can move. It's hard to retain like commitment to supporting this work, I think, sometimes.
Yeah, that kind of sounds like an accessibility issue almost, like how accessible is the process to folks who may not be able to make it at the designated time or the designated singular time, or it's not accessible for many other reasons. How about one more person? What is your experience with policy making in Boston then?
Oh, I attend different community meetings. I go to different hearings. I speak up, but sometimes you might be in the minority when I speak up. And even with the in people, it seems like the BRA and them, they don't listen. They don't even listen to the people that are in. I mean, that's a common complaint from upper to lower people. It doesn't, and I do email things about meetings to people and everything, but you kind of feel like you don't get too much. There's a lot of complaining against the BRA, the BPTA, and the community. And a lot of community groups homeowners have a lot more say than others.
Thank you. That's really helpful insight and perspective. Yeah, it's really frustrating to be in rooms where ostensibly we're being asked to participate, but really it can feel kind of symbolic, or feel like we're not being heard or listened to. And some of that is kind of by design. So this might be familiar to folks who were here last week, but this is something called ladder participation, and it's a way of understanding how people participate in decision making, and this can be in the civic space or in the municipal space. But essentially, the promise of democracy is at its core a promise of governance by the people and for the people. And so this exists, governance exists at many different levels. And so some of what you all described was like being invited to listen, to inform, or maybe even to consult, or there's just a limited amount of participation across these different kinds of mechanisms you'll see along the left-hand side of the screen. But it falls short of what we will call participatory democracy, or like full participation in the decision-making process. So movements for participatory democracy, or what we're calling community-led decision-making and co-governance, are kind of an urgent effort to transform the promise of democracy that's as yet unfulfilled into a reality. So civic engagement and other responses to systemic issues of democracy kind of view voting in elections as an end goal. People are engaged, mobilized, and a representative is elected. But in this process, we lose large segments of the community, and often after expending large amounts of money and time campaigning and pushing money votes. So the one method that we have to actively participate in shaping decisions by choosing the people who shape those decisions isn't really always effective, and sometimes it's antithetical to the kinds of things that we're trying to accomplish. So Democracy Beyond Elections is an initiative seeking to imagine what it would look like if communities were empowered and equipped to have a real voice in the decisions that impact their lives. We're trying to answer the question, what does it mean to have and practice direct participatory democracy? So we're using participatory democracy as an umbrella term here for a range of practices for sharing decision-making power. Participatory democracy can be broadly thought about as community-led decision-making that's equitable, accessible, and significant. Participatory democracy is a model of co-governance that seeks to directly challenge anti-democratic processes like corporate control of municipal, state, and federal legislative and governance bodies. So Louise, you mentioned the BRA, which is the Boston Redevelopment Authority, which has a lot of decisions by that body are swayed by entities like large corporate developers whose interests are often not in alignment with the communities that they're operating within. So participatory democracy is useful in diminishing the divide between elected officials and community members by embracing the fact that electeds are and should be members of the communities they represent and should be accountable to them. So that when we make decisions together, we make decisions that are better, more efficient, and more sustainable for us all. Models of participatory budgeting include things like, or participatory democracy include things like participatory budgeting, participatory policymaking and policy juries, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. But these kinds of things allow for us not only to redefine, but also move beyond civic participation and inhabit community power. And inhabiting community power allows us to directly challenge the anti-democratic practices and cultures that we've talked about. And I think this isn't something that's unfamiliar to folks at Ujima, because the way that Ujima operates is very much participatory and very much rooted in direct democracy. So it will come as no surprise to you that by utilizing kind of this framework, this means that we're not only able to redefine who is at the table to make major decisions that impact our lives, but also rebuild that table to ensure that historically disincluded and disenfranchised perspectives are brought forward, especially those of Black and Brown communities and working class low income communities, that our accessibility needs are met, that meetings happen at a time when people can actually participate in them, or that there are multiple avenues for feedback. And we're able to ensure that the decisions we reach together bear the intended significant and substantive positive impacts on our communities that we strived for in the first place, or strove for in the first place. And of course, that these changes require more than the political will of a few elected officials. They require deep structural change, a real commitment to co-governance from elected officials, and investments in community powers and strong advocacy from communities for those investments. And there are many ways that that can be accomplished, and we'll get into a few of the different strategies and mechanisms for accomplishing these goals in just a bit. But before that, I would just welcome us all to consider what happens when we're able to successfully design and implement participatory democracy via things like participatory budgeting and policymaking and policy juries. We're able to shift decision-making power to community members who have been marginalized and excluded. We're able to generate more equitable and effective decisions. And we're able to make political processes more inclusive and representative of the communities that they take place in. All things which democracy should be doing in the first place anyways, that we see that it doesn't often do effectively. But this allows folks to transform their relationship with government and with each other and demonstrate how their engagement can transcend the kinds of feedback loops and other not really participatory mechanisms that are available to us, like offering public comment at city council hearings, which may or may not be taken. It allows us to strengthen relationships between community members, between our neighbors, as we deliberate about which things are and are not best for our communities. And it allows us to develop ourselves, to continue flexing that slow twitch muscle of democratic practice that we all need in order to make more effective decisions with each other. So probably not much new for y'all at Ujima, but just some hopefully helpful level setting for what we mean when we're talking about participatory democracy. Now I'll turn it over to Elizabeth to talk about some specific models.
Thank you, Charles. You can go ahead and move on to the next slide. So when we talk about participatory democracy, we talk about how we do participatory democracy. So it's participatory budgeting is one example. You learned about that from Chris last week. It allows community members to directly decide how to spend a part of a public budget. We also talk about non-budget participation, like participatory policymaking, which allows community members to identify, develop, and vote on new policy proposals. And we also talk about policy juries or assemblies, which is a representative sample of community members. I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide. So policy juries, like I said, they're a representative sample of community members. So think of it like a jury in a trial. It's, people randomly selected to come together, design the process, learn about an issue, deliberate together, and then make a recommendation or make a recommendation about a policy. So if you go to the next slide, where this has been the most prolific is in Ireland. So in 2016 to 2018, there were 99 randomly selected Irish citizens to represent a sample of the general public. They spent 10 weekends over a year together, deliberating 5 issues, including abortion, climate change, and challenges of an aging population. They learned from experts, discussed in groups, and then made recommendations for a course of action by the government. In one of these recommendations, abortion, Parliament actually decided to hold a referendum on the recommendation of the Citizen Assembly, which was to legalize abortion. And it actually passed by a very wide margin. So that's kind of the process for how Ireland got legalized abortion. The Assembly the referendum was held with historic turnout. And they also declared a climate emergency as one of the recommendations from the Citizens Assembly in Ireland. One of the kind of virtues of a Citizen Assembly or citizen juries is that it allows cities or wherever that decides to do it to really tackle an issue when politicians or elected officials get stuck and they can't move forward. So in Ireland, abortion had been an issue that they had fought over for many years. So they did decide to convene the Citizens Assembly to think through and make recommendations about what should happen with abortion in Ireland. So I wanted to pause and see if there are any issues in Boston that you think a policy jury or policy assembly could benefit from the perspective of a policy jury. So are there any issues that you guys have been like going back and forth on for many, many years and just can't move forward with it, just really stuck? And feel free to speak it out or say it in the chat.
Rent control.
Birth control?
Rent control back.
Rent control, rent control. Tell me more about that.
Well, it's, well, the whole thing is they used to have rent control. But the whole thing is when the landlords got rid of it, Boston, Cambridge, Brookline voted for rent control. But because of the home rule petition, when the Irish took over the city, the Yankees didn't want to have so much power. So we had to go before the state for it to get approved for a lot of things. And so it went, but the state went against it. The state against it because you have all, well, Western Massachusetts would feel it didn't affect them. But now we're looking, Springfield, Lawrence, and those places are having problems. And we're thinking if you unite with, you start uniting with other cities that are having rental problems, everything. It's the whole,
That is a really good example. I saw another example in the chat, a percentage of affordable housing that developers need to add more to new projects. That is also a really good example of something that could potentially be solved through a recommendation of a policy jury. Next slide, please. Another model that I want to talk about is something that we're calling participatory policy making. It was a model that was co-developed by PBP and some other Democracy Beyond Elections partners last summer. We decided to kind of look at the best pieces of the policy jury model and the best pieces of the participatory budgeting model and create kind of a hybrid model where we design the process, launch community engagement, convene the community policy team, which could be a representative sample, but it also could work more like a participatory budgeting steering committee, which is like volunteers from the community. They learn together, they develop policy recommendations, and kind of one of the key differences between this model and the policy jury model is that we think in the beginning, the elected official or whoever it is that is sharing their power, giving up their power to this policy team to make in the community to make the decision, should commit on the front end to allow for a community vote. So allow for a community referendum on what those policy recommendations are. So they commit to the community vote, they honor the vote and implement the result. And then part of everything that we do and recommend is analyze data and share results. So ensuring that we're learning and moving forward and ensuring that that piece is actually ongoing so that whatever policy recommendation gets implemented is not causing any harm with the community and it's actually helping the community. So if you want to go to the next slide. We actually piloted this model earlier this year. We kicked off a pilot with an 8-member policy team developed of 6 students and a restorative justice coordinator. We worked with this Brooklyn high school campus. So schools in Brooklyn are co-located. So there were 5 schools in this campus. We convened a policy team of students, mostly students. So we brought them together, they designed the process, we did some learning, we launched broader community engagement. So think about like PB, that idea collection phase. We actually reached out to the entire school community to hear their ideas about participatory budgeting, but also participatory policy. So they were given $250,000 from the Brooklyn Borough president. They were for capital projects, which are long-term infrastructure projects. And then they were given $10,000 from their school for expense projects, which could be after school programs, field trips, etc. But then they also had the power to create and vote on policy changes in their school that would make them more safe and supportive. So we worked with the students, we did the community engagement, and then we did some shared learning together. So at the end, they proposed some policy changes. They wanted to create a more robust restorative justice discipline systems, or those words are contradictory, but replace their current discipline system with a more restorative justice system, and make sure that the teachers and the administrators and the students all had training in what that meant. So currently in the honor and vote and implement phase and analyze data and share results phase. So yeah, wanted to stop there, see if there are any questions. I do have a couple more examples that I can hit on briefly since we're talking about zoning and development. There is a alderman in Chicago, Alderman Ramirez Rosa, who took office in 2015 and initiated a 6-month-long process to restructure the way zoning and development decisions were made in his district. So alder people have next one. Alder people have jurisdictions over zoning decisions which have historically been one of the most significant sources of power. So Alderman Ramirez Rosa campaigned on a promise to democratize the zoning process by developing a new process that was transparent, democratic, inclusive, of everyone in the community, regardless of their education, citizenship, economic status, or dominant language. The model has 3 basic components. When an applicant or a developer seeks a zoning change, they submit an application with key details about the project and information about the developers and contractors to the alderman's office. The alderman receives the application and sends it out to several community groups for review. The set of groups that have taken on an advisory role. The reviewing community group has the opportunity to meet one-on-one with the alderman's office and make recommendations. And then the community group deems that the project may proceed through the process. It moves to a full community meeting. Then the entire community within, I think it's an 800-foot radius, is invited to a community meeting where they actually get to vote on whether or not the development or the rezoning will be approved. So, and the alderman agrees to this on the front end so that they know when they come in that they have the power as a community to decide the future of that development. So really amazing process. They just got a 100% affordable housing development approved in their neighborhood through this process. So really amazing work being done in Chicago. The last thing I'll hit on is ballot initiatives. So this is probably the most prolific participatory democracy practice that we have in the US. And some, I will say, are more participatory than others. So some of these are developed by the community on the front end and then go to the vote by the community on the back end. Some of them are developed a little bit differently. So some of them have organizations that put forward these initiatives and they get the signatures to go on the ballot and then they campaign for it. Sometimes it's corporations that are doing the petitioning or fighting the petition, as we saw in California. I just want to lift up this initiative in Oklahoma that happened, Oklahoma State Question 780 and 781. So what they decided to do was to reclassify drug possession and property crime from felony to misdemeanor in an effort to reduce the prison population. They also took those funds from reducing the prison population and put them back in their community for substance abuse and mental health services. This passed in 2016 and has been a really amazing process to watch communities take on that policy piece that is so important. I mean, we do a lot of work with defund and divest invest movements, but I think there's this policy piece of reimagining public safety for communities that some of these participatory practices can be used for. So I'll stop there. I know I said I would stop earlier. I'm going to stop there. Open it up to any questions, any thoughts, feedback, any other conversation about how these could work in Boston.
I have some thoughts.
Yes.
If it's okay to jump in. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all these examples. I guess I feel a little bit of a need to announce myself in the room as an urban planner, but not for the BPDA. And so just having trying to work with a lot of communities, trying to be mission driven and, equity oriented, very often at my firm try to advocate for participatory budgeting. But I had never really heard about this sort of participatory policy creation, which to me is just super, super cool, specifically around how it's used for zoning codes. So I just want to say thank you for the education. It's been super helpful. But some questions, like something that I find that we run into a lot at our firm is the tension between wanting to create as much room for space and discourse and voice, but then also the realities of momentum and creating things that people need. And being that discourse usually takes time, how are some ways that you have found with this democratic policy creation that you're either able to get more buy-in from the community, that things are going to take a while, or how do you navigate those tensions?
Yeah, I'll start. Charles, please feel free to jump in, or anyone else. I think transparency is the key. Being clear, very, very clear on the front end, what the process is going to be, where the opportunities for engagement are, and like what the process is going to be at the end for approving or not approving the recommendations from the policy team, and also how the ideas from the community at large are going to be integrated into those recommendations. So just transparency and being super, super clear the timeline in the process and why participatory democracy in particular takes time. And it's a practice. So it's about flexing those muscles that someone mentioned earlier, and really like setting that expectation that this is how it should be. So Alderman Rosa has been doing this for 5 years now. So there's this expectation on the community that whenever there's a zoning, like they're plugged into that now. They really understand how the process works, and they have this expectation that they're going to have a say in what happens in their community.
But I think in trouble, Boston has formed community groups to discuss zoning, and community groups have written a whole bunch of zoning, and the BRA sometimes just the zoning's there, but the BRA keeps giving exemptions and keeps just swipes it under the board. Doesn't follow it.
Gotcha. So you're saying that there is a community group that does some consultation around zoning, but the board isn't.
Not all the time, but there has been a time where groups did make zoning.
Gotcha. But the board isn't required to listen to that feedback.
No, they're recorded to listen. They put it into the code.
Gotcha.
They put it into the regulations, but they don't always follow the regulations. Or they give all kinds of exemptions.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a problem.
And that turns people off. I mean, people get pretty bold. They do all the work, and then the BRA kind of just ignores it.
Yeah, I think the accountability piece is also really important. So there's that transparency on the front end, but also the accountability on the back end. So what is the mechanism for accountability, and how are we ensuring that people are doing what they say they're going to do, and that also with policy that is not harming. So, there can be some really good intentions that a policy team comes to and then the community comes to, but really doing that constant evaluation to ensure that it's doing what it's supposed to do and not causing more harm.
I do have another question, if people are still ruminating as well. When you mentioned the process about the organization that met, the Citizen Policy Creation Organization, like for 10 weekends over the course of the year, do you know if those people were paid for that work, or was it considered like jury duty and it was more just an expectation?
They were absolutely compensated for their work. So their travel was paid. If they had to go to a different part of the country, then they were paid for their time. Childcare was provided, etc. So they did a lot of that work to ensure it was accessible to all folks.
And then, thank you for that. I just wanted to interject and interrupt and ask, because I know that Lena, I know you had a question earlier related to some examples, and I apologize for missing you, but I just want to circle back and see if you still had that question or if it's still relevant to this piece of the conversation.
No, I think this conversation is great. I think mine wasn't so much a question, but an answer to the question that was posed of when have we not felt included? And I think that the access piece was what I was speaking about, or what I was going to ask about, but somebody else brought it up.
Cool. Thank you. That's all I had.
Thank you. I'm sorry I missed your hand.
You're fine.
I guess I don't know. This is sort of a broader question just around just like participatory planning. And just like, because I think that like trust building is really important, and like because I think people often see what has been done, but like don't often see like the I don't know, the relationships that needs to happen and like the time. And I'm part of this campaign, and I like go to this events and stuff, and one of the things I'm always encouraging is us to like think about how do we connect with each other to like sustain this type of like these type of moves. I don't know. Maybe it sounds really simplistic, but like it still feels missing sometimes, and like so I guess my question really is like, what are some ways that y'all have witnessed like communities like doing that work in tandem with like deploying participatory planning like practices, but like maybe even beforehand? Do you guys know of any like?
Charles, do you want to jump in on that one?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that I've learned over the past few months is how difficult it is to do that like relationship building and sustaining work in the virtual space. And I know, folks have been saying this for a year and a half or almost 2 years now, but it is really challenging because there's something really special about being able to share space with someone, and all of the kind of there's this conceptualization of what it means to like study and how study happens even before a professor, someone teaching enters the classroom, within students just talking to each other or people just observing other things that are happening. And I think the same is true for relationship building. It happens before, all right, everyone, let's get into breakout sessions and, talk about our lives. It's complimenting someone's shirt, or, these are the kind of really small things that I think don't translate well all the time into the space. But I think with that being said, some of the things that have been successful have been like creating intentionally non-intentional spaces. So spaces for people just to try to share some of that time and space in the virtual world without an agenda, just to get to know each other a little bit more. But it's really an open question still, at least for me. And I think it's a really important question.
Yeah, I think that's right. The only thing I will add is one thing that we've seen particularly in New York is when these processes are done right, and when they center equity, accessibility, and inclusion, it's a really good way, like these processes are a really good way to actually bring people together and learn from each other and build community. So it's actually one of the impacts and the intended consequences of doing these participatory practices.
Thank you both. I appreciate that.
Well, also, we can't always trust when the government's running it, you don't always trust. The government will have to live through more of its promises and do what the ones running it.
Absolutely.
Any final thoughts, questions? We're almost at time for our workshop, but definitely want to give space for any other sort of lingering thoughts. Cool, y'all. Thank you so much, Charles and Elizabeth. This is like super, super helpful. We appreciate y'all coming through.
Amazing. Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah. And we'll see y'all. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Johnny.
I was gonna say, let's all just wave to the YouTube family. For them. Bye, y'all. We'll stop recording now.